Welcome to the only daily podcast focusing on compliance news of the day. Each morning, start your day with a cup of coffee and Tom Fox, the voice of compliance, to hear about 4 of the top compliance, corruption, or leadership stories you will need to start your day. The Daily Compliance News is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.
The Daily Compliance News for August 25, 2021, the Farewell to Charlie edition. We're going to save that story till the end and begin with the story from CNBC, a first-time contributor to the Daily Compliance News, that climate change will disrupt supply chains much more than COVID has, and businesses need to prepare. This article basically says climate change is going to wreak havoc on supply chains, and you really need to get ahead of this problem by being proactive. So if you're in compliance, that means new and additional risks. Next up from the New York Times, a very interesting article about female entrepreneurs who say they are constantly compared to Elizabeth Holmes, the disgraced founder of Theranos. It provides the example of Alice Zhang, who raised money to set up a drug discovery startup, and investors kept asking her about Theranos. Others ask as well, and the pattern is becoming clear that female entrepreneurs are now living in the shadow of Elizabeth Holmes, obviously not a good shadow to be in, and with the fraud that she's alleged to have engaged in, it's becoming problematic. Next up, from the Wall Street Journal, Risk and Compliance Journal, Dylan Tokar reporting that the FIFA corruption scandal still continues to resonate, as a former Salvadorian soccer official pled guilty in the case. Ronaldo Vasquez, former president of El Salvador's National Soccer Federation, was charged by U.S. prosecutors in 2015, but was only recently extradited to the U.S. He pled guilty to 1 count of racketeering Monday in a virtual hearing held in the District Court of Brooklyn. Prosecutors said Vasquez and his co-conspirators solicited and took bribes in exchange for awarding media and marketing contracts for World Cup qualifying matches played in El Salvador. And our lead story is, of course, the sad death of Charlie Watts. Charlie Watts was one of the greatest rock and roll drummers of all time. He spent almost his entire career with the Rolling Stones. He died peaceably yesterday. His publicist confirmed the statement. Watts' death comes weeks after it was announced that he would not be able to perform on the Rolling Stones' No Filter tour of U.S. stadiums this summer. And although it's hard to imagine the Stones without Watts, I'm sure they will continue on. Unlike the Road Warriors' Keith Richards, Watts seemed uninterested in touring and gave the distinct impression that the Stones' position was more of a job than a calling. Nevertheless, he was one of the great drummers. He didn't have a lot of flash. He set a steady beat, and he was always there. He joined the group in 1963 and played with them through their last tour, which I was privileged to see. He was not a part of the hard partying 60s scene. He was content to stay in his hotel room when the Rolling Stones were on tour, although in the 80s he did succumb to drug addiction, but he was able to pull himself out of that. So goodbye to Charlie Watts. I don't know what you're going to do, but I'm going to put on a plethora of Rolling Stones albums and listen to Charlie Watts drum today. The Daily Compliance News is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network and a proud member of C-Suite Radio. Thanks so much for listening. I hope you'll join me again tomorrow.